believe not Ninja Gaiden. I'm not the guy to fight with them lightning. They come in dumb and I leave them enlightened. It's time to pay the price, man. Give it to the nice man. Go DJ, scratch it like it's lice, man.
What's up, my wizards? Dev from MTG, the place down there. We are still brewing up Battle for Zendikar, and we've got something really cool today. This is Hardened Scales, a deck that a lot of people are very excited for and can be made many different ways. There's Mono Green Hardened Scales, there's Teamer Hardened Scales, which I've seen going around. There's Abzan Hardened Scales, which is probably a really, really good deck. But today, in order to showcase as many, BFZ cards as we possibly can, we're going to go ahead and do Golgari Green-Black Hardened Scales. Well, a good place to start is a playset of Hardened Scales. Good jumping off point, I would say. Definitely want to play a full playset of this. We always want to get it on the first turn, and multiple copies of it are really, really good. So, I don't see any reason not to play the playset. This is a Hardened Scales deck, and I've seen some Hardened Scales decks that play 3. I'm going full-on playset here, because every single one of our creatures has a way of getting counters on it, and we're playing a spell or two that puts counters on creatures too. So, yes to the playset. To go along with that, before we get into anything Battle for Zendikar here, we are going to play Servant of the Scale at a playset in this deck, and also, I think Hangarback Walker. Obviously, Hangarback Walker is already one of the dominant cards in the format, and Hardened Scales just makes it even better. 2 mana for a 2/2 in this case, 4 mana for a 3/3, it's really, really much better than even it normally is. So, and we're doing a lot of cool things with Hangarback Walker in this deck. We can get more +1/+1 counters on it than, just by casting it. So, want to play Hangarback Walker all day. Definitely goes in this. And Servant of the Scale has a lot of cool tricks too. And she's much better than she looks. Let's move into the 2-drops here. Now we have some options, but one thing that I definitely want to play from BFC is Rot Shambler. I think this is actually a really good looking card that I haven't gotten a chance to talk about yet. Obviously this counts on your dudes dying, which sounds pretty bad, but your creatures are going to die. Just naturally, creatures die over the course of the game, and this thing can get pretty big. I mean, after just a couple of dudes die, it's already fairly big, and obviously in decks where we can control it, we want to sacrifice things. So things like Nentuko Husk, and we've got a couple of spells here, which I'll talk about later, that help us, sacrifice dudes to get value. And obviously we're playing Hangarback Walker. Rot Shambler is pretty good in that regard, and we're playing at least one creature that helps us sacrifice dudes, although we don't want to do too much of that because we're very devoted to +1/+1 counters. But Rot Shambler, that being said, is still good on its own because, again, our creatures naturally die, and over the course of the game, left unchecked, this can become a 5 or 6/6 even pretty quickly. I think also a no-brainer for the deck while we're in the 2-drops here is Avatar of the Resolute. Again, not a brand new card or anything, but this is the deck for it, and we're all wondering what to do with it, post-rotation, because some people play this in sort of the mono-green thing or green devotion. You see it occasionally, but not too often, this alongside Reverend Hunter. So what I'm going to do with it after the rotation, I think this goes pretty well in this deck, definitely. Just anything with Hardened Scales, Avatar. We're also going to go ahead and play Den Protector in the deck. At least a 2, maybe a 3 of, I would say. Just really don't have to go into the reasons why we play Den Protector, right? I mean, we're playing Hangarback Walker and a couple of other things. You can see that there's some older strategies at play here. Servant of the Scale, Hangarback Walker, and we can get him back with Den Protector and any other spells we may play or anything that goes to the graveyard, obviously. So, I just don't see any reason not to play it. And it fits in with our theme, too. We can flip up a 4/3 Den Protector, which is nothing to sneeze at, especially with that ability he's got that people don't pay much attention to. But once you get a good amount of power on him, that thing becomes pretty relevant pretty quickly. So, yes to Den Protector for the millionth time. A 2-drop spell that I really want to play at least a couple of copies of is Earthen Arms. The Awaken is a thing on the card. It does matter that the card has Awaken, but just being able to put basically 3 +1/+1 counters on something as long as we've got a Hardened Scales out is just really, really good. And all of our creatures benefit in some way from having counters on them. Hangarback Walker, this works really well with just 2 mana, get an eventual 2 more 1/1 flyers and make him bigger for the time being. So, again, a lot of these cards have synergy with Hangarback. It's just really a centerpiece card in the deck for a lot of reasons. It's a +1/+1 counter deck. Hangarback Walker goes with literally everything, so I sound like a broken record. But this can play on other things more, also. We're playing a couple of 3-drops. This works really well on a couple of 2-drops even. This works pretty well on. So, like the card, and we'll definitely play at least a couple of them. An option that we have at 2-drop that I'm probably definitely not going to play is Einot Guide, but this works with at least one of the cards that we're playing as far as that land ability, put a land on top, or the +1/+1 counter. You can have basically a 2-mana 3/3, so that's pretty cool too. I don't see anything necessarily wrong with Einot Guide. I just think that we can play better 2-drops. If one of these 2-drops that we're playing didn't exist, then Einot Guide would not be a bad choice, but I just think it's just barely not there. Onto our 3-drops. One thing that's really integral to the deck that we get out of BFZ is Drana. Yeah, Drana is insane. Maybe one of the better cards in the deck, and certainly in the set, and definitely, at least in my top 10. So I think it's going to be fairly impactful on Standard too. I mean, just insane stats. And the first strike on this is hilarious. Her combat damage goes through first. Your guys get the counter, and then they'll do their combat damage. So that's just so great. You gotta love Drana, man. I don't see any reason not to play this. And with the Hardened Scales, this gets really, really stupid because all your dudes get 2 +1/+1 counters. So yeah, Drana, man. I want to play as many copies of her as I can fit into the deck without running into the Legend rule too hard. Although I'm pretty sure they're going to do their damnedest to remove her. She's going to have a bullseye on her head. So I'm probably going to end up playing 3. I may play 1, possibly 2 copies of Voracious Null. Now, this is where we get into a conversation about what we could or could not play. We are playing, obviously, Rot Shambler, Servant of the Scale, Hangarback Walker. I mean, it's not a terrible idea to sacrifice creatures, but same token, we're working pretty hard to get +1/+1 counters on some of our dudes, so we don't want to sacrifice a lot of creatures. But again, a play set of Hangarback, we got Servant of the Scale, and Rot Shambler gets bigger when things die, so there's sort of a push-pull there. I think Voracious Null is the best option we have available, because it also has synergy with the +1/+1 counter strategy. If we can basically put 3 +1/+1 counters on this when we sacrifice a guy, that's not bad, especially considering we have, Den Protector, and we're playing Mortuary Mire in the land base to help us get creatures back that we sacrifice. So those are things to consider. Now, spells that I considered instead of Voracious Null were Bone Splinters. That's a cool removal spell, especially if we can sacrifice our own Hangarback Walker to it. That's really good. And Servant of the Scale, we can sacrifice that, keep his power on the board, A lot of ways we can mitigate the damage done by Bone Splinters. So I think it's a fairly powerful card, but again, we just don't want to go sacrificing creatures willy-nilly. And I wanted to maybe play Altar's Reap. I can see that being an important card. Again, Hangarback Walker, get a bunch of flyers, at least 2 or 3 flyers maybe, and then, draw 2 cards. That's pretty darn cool, especially, again, considering we can get these cards back with a couple of different cards that we're playing. But didn't end up playing either of those spells and went with Voracious, the Thrall, over those 2 cards because, again, more synergy with the +1/+1 counter strategy, and it's always good to have creatures on the board, and this can get pretty big pretty fast. Here's another conversation we have to have, and that's Managorger Hydra versus Undergrowth Champion. Now, Managorger Hydra wants to be a 3-drop. You want to play it as early as possible to maximize the value you get out of that. Undergrowth Champion, on the other hand, is often a 4-drop, as you want to play it and then immediately drop a land so as to cover it in combat and against, damage-based removal and things like that. So they play a little bit differently, and you'll often play Undergrowth Champion a turn ahead of Managorger Hydra because you want Hydra to get as big as possible, and that's just how that is. There's a couple of other things. Now, Managorger Hydra, a little bit easier to remove. It can be removed by damage-based, removal. More so than Undergrowth Champion, obviously. If they cast a Wild Slash, it's going to get a counter on it. And if it's still just a 1/1, the Wild Slash will still kill it. But if you can play a spell, perhaps that's a possibility. But then it'll become a 3/3. But it still gets killed very easily by Roast, pretty quickly. So it's definitely easier to kill, and in combat it's easier to kill than Undergrowth Champion. Undergrowth Champion far more resilient and can get pretty big over the course of the game. Obviously, players are going to play spells one way or the other, and Gorger Hydra can probably get bigger over the course of the game, but again, Undergrowth Champion does more with its power because the more +1/+1 counters you put on it, the more of a beast it gets, especially in combat and against burn decks. It's just completely out of the range of Roast and any other thing that we might be playing that does direct damage to a creature. This does, over here, Undergrowth Champion, have more synergy with Hardened Scales overall, because we can put, we get extra counters with Gorger Hydra too, but with Undergrowth Champion, again, we can do more with those counters. counters. So if I had to pick one to play over the other, I would probably play Undergrowth Champion in the deck. To be honest with you, I can understand both sides of the argument. That's why I've laid out both sides of the argument, however sloppily. But in any case, I can see both sides, is all I'm saying. But I prefer Undergrowth Champion because I want a creature that sticks around almost no matter what, especially once things start getting completely out of hand. Before I move on here, another 3-drop we could play is Salt Road Quartermasters. Obviously, this gets an extra counter when it comes into play, and when we distribute counters, it distributes an extra counter. So, a lot of cool synergy with Hardened Scales there, but just like I Not Guide, I just think it's a half step off from being where we want it to be, and just doesn't feel quite competitive enough, and actually feels a little gimmicky. But that being said, it's a proper mana sink, that's true, and it's a 3-mana 4/4 if we have Hardened Scales out. And I mean, when we move counters, we get 2 counters. That's pretty darn good too. So I could definitely see making a case for Saltwood Quartermasters. I just probably won't end up playing it myself here. We have to play some removal in the deck, I would say. I mean, we risk the chance of coming up the board a little too much. I mean, like the problem with Simic, for example, is that it can have great board presence, but it can't deal with anything that they're doing, you know, and I don't want to fall into that same trap. I want to be able to remove creatures, and we are in the colors for it, or at least one of the colors for it. So let's play 2 copies of Ruinous Path, and probably 1 ultimate price, I would say. Now, again, we can awaken Ruinous Path, but that's not super important. When we can, it's pretty darn good. And again, we'll get an extra counter off of Awaken. If we have a Hardened Scales in place, so there's that to consider too. But mostly we just want to remove creatures and planeswalkers with it, and the ultimate price is a fairly reliable creature remover, unless we're playing against Eldrazi decks. Well, we can side it out, whatever. Quickly, we're playing 1 copy of Inspiring Call in the main deck here, and we can all see why. This can be a huge blowout, drawing you a ton of cards, and it's a good response to mass removal, although Languish beats it, Tragic Arrogance beats it, and Arrogance is seeing a little bit more play than originally. You know, people are starting to come around to how good that card is. But we still see some play out of Inhostilities and Crux of Fate, so it responds well to those. You know, not a terrible card, all in all, and even if your creatures don't survive something, you know, it's just, sometimes you can draw 3-4 cards off of this, so I want to play it all day. And finally, to finish the main deck off here, I want to play 1 or 2 copies of Ob Nixilis, which I know is sort of a surprise inclusion, but I'm pretty sure the card is really good in a lot of shells. People are talking about it aggro, people are talking about control and mid-range. It just looks like it goes into everything. I know some people weren't too high on this card when it first got spoiled, but it looks pretty darn good to me. And Luis Scott Vargas is a fan. He actually has a great quote. He says that everything this card does helps you win the game. You know, once a turn, it helps you win the game. Drawing cards is great. Everyone loves advantage. Blowing creatures off the board is great. Everybody loves that. And you really put a great clock on the opponent if you can get his ultimate off, which is not in any way unheard of. It's totally doable to get his ultimate off. So everything he does for you is good. We're sort of an aggro-y deck. We're not playing too much over the 3-drop slot, except for Obs. So this is pretty good in helping refill our hand after we sort of just all of it onto the battlefield. So this is a good refill, just like Inspiring Call, and can get huge dudes out of the way, which is pretty good for us too. We can just blow up their best creature a couple of turns, you know. So everything Ob Nixilis does is good in my opinion, and I can totally see him working in a lot of different shells, and is pretty good at the top of the curve in this, you know. Once we've gotten our game plan going, gotten some counters on some dudes, we can drop Obs, blow up a dude, maybe refill our hand a little bit. You know, there's just so many things that we can do with this, and I want to play Nyx. Here's the land base here. We're playing 24 lands in the deck. Obviously, we have to get to Ob Nixilis, so we want to play a few more lands. And we want to be able to awaken those spells a little bit later on in the game. That's important to be able to do. We're playing, you know, Earthen Arms and Ruinous Path. We want to cast Hangarback Walker for as much mana as possible. We want to be able to morph and flip up Dim Protector on the same turn. There's a lot of reasons to play extra lands, and I could even see playing 25 in the deck. This is what we're going for here. Quick note before I move on here in the sideboard. Retreat to Kazandu. That's the only card from BFC we're playing in the sideboard. And some players might want to play it in the main deck. I just don't think that it quite ticks right with the rest of the machinery in the deck. At least not in the main board what we're doing. But if you want to outlast some decks, this is pretty good. And you've always got the +1/+1 counter synergy with Hardened Scales, which is the entire reason you'd play it in the main deck. I'm just not sure that it's worth giving up a turn for against everything in the format. That's all for this one for now. Notice I'm not assigning power rankings to these decks yet because I'm not sure yet. I haven't been able to test them enough to really assign power rankings to them, so I'm not going to do that yet. I'm sure that we'll get, you know, some versions of these once the format settles down, and we can do them a little bit more in depth once we know a little bit more about the format. These are all speculative. With that in mind, the very next thing we're doing is Allies, which will be up in a couple of days, along with the set review, which will be up hopefully Monday if we can help it, or at least the beginning of the set review. So if you haven't subscribed yet, please do that because we've got a lot of content coming up. And I'm going to do maybe Allies a couple of different ways, by the way, maybe Orzhov Allies, and then the Mardu sort of March from the Tomb oriented, give your dudes haste and do stuff deck. Probably get a couple of different decks with Allies, so look forward to that. And like, share, comment, you know, I love to hear what you guys have to say about these. Likes are awesome, and so our shares are probably the best thing in the world, so please help us out with that. If you have any other ideas or anything for deck techs, again, always open, let us know. I am Dev from SBMTG, as always. Thanks for watching, my wizards.